Now that we've addressed human intelligence, we're ready to talk about how we gather enough sensory information to use our brains, well, intelligently. Our subject is multisensory perception. To talk about that, we have to discuss how frosted cornflakes are made. Yes, frosted cornflakes. Doesn't sound very intelligent at all, I know. But it is. In fact, it's a perfect metaphor for the little we can say in general terms about how the brain processes and allows you to perceive sensory information. Like the brain, it turns out making frosted cornflakes is surprisingly complicated. Manufacturers don't simply slice up thin bits of corn, toast them up, add some sugar, then put the whole thing in a box. Rather, the process goes something like this. Corn kernels are first removed from their cobs via a milling process, then ground up by a worm screw. The pulverized corn is now unrecognizable as corn. It looks like a lumpy paste, a sticky pellet-like mass called, appropriately enough, grits. Malted barley is added for flavor. The mixture is dried somewhat and rolled into flakes and finally toasted. What's left is reconstituted into the more familiar chips. These toasted flakes are then sorted by shaking to create a uniform size, sprayed with sweeteners, dried again, sprayed with vitamins, then packaged. Voila, frosted cornflakes. Hungry yet? The whole thing can be summarized in 3 steps. A, you deconstruct the corn into parts, and then B, reconstitute the parts into a different shape after C, adding new ingredients. This parts plus new ingredients is now the sellable product. Like I said, it's complicated and vaguely off-putting. Believe it or not, the brain processes sensory information in a fashion very similar to making frosted cornflakes. There is a deconstruction step, there is an addition of new ingredients step, and a final reassembly step. Only when the brain has gone through these machinations does it allow you to dig into the bowl of life and perceive something. But it's worth noting that our perceptions of the world are as far removed from reality as our highly processed cornflakes are from kernels of corn. We're going to spend our entire lecture talking about this process, which I'll divide into 3 parts. Part 1, some basics. Part 2, sensations and perceptions. Part 3, multisensory issues. The practical application involves another way to improve learning, especially if you have to memorize a bunch of stuff. So, let's get started. You probably learned in Mrs. Johnson's grade school science class there are 5 senses: taste, smell, vision, touch, and hearing. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Mrs. Johnson was wrong. There are many other senses besides this famous quintet, so we may need to amend your grade school learning. Let me give an example of a sense that lies outside the big 5. Look at my reddish nose for a minute. While you're still looking at my reddish nose, do you know where your big toes are? Do you? Don't move your feet, don't wiggle your toes, just conjure up the location. You probably had no trouble with this, but I have to ask you a question. Why do you know that? Why do you know where your toe is? It's not signaling any information to you, yet you sense its perceptions. We call this special sense kinesthesia. It's your ability to be consciously aware of the position of you and your body parts independent of vision. You know where that body part is localized even when it moves. That's a sense for sure, but it lies outside the traditional big 5. Surprised? There are other senses as well, from acceleration to feeling pain, and the complexity doesn't end with adding to Mrs. Johnson's list. Even within a single sense, there are subcategories. Perceiving sound. Say when you are listening to music is a complex buffet of frequencies and beats and instruments and even their locations in 3-dimensional space. The point is, you have a whole lot of senses and within each, a whole lot of subcategories. So if I'm going to try to explain how these work together to give you your perceptions of reality, that's what multisensory processing does, and also stay relevant to the Frosted Flakes cornflakes, I've got a really big job to do. We begin by returning to breakfast foods. Some of my favorite sensations in the world are the smells, sounds, and sights of breakfast. I am a special sucker for the triple threat of sizzling sausage, the snaps and pops of frying bacon, the sweet siren smell of maple syrup. When I detect such delightful combinations, if I'm not the one cooking, I try to hunt down the source. If I'm successful, I may be treated to another delight, this time visual. I can watch the sausage charring in a pan, the bacon frying in a pan, warm maple syrup warming up in a pan. What is going on in my brain in general terms when I behold such loveliness? We can divide the entire process of me encountering breakfast into A, sensations, and B, perceptions of sensations. We'll go through each, beginning with sensation. Sensation is usually defined as the body's response to some outside stimulus. It can be described in 3 steps. Number 1, initiation. The process begins when some sensory receptor apparatus in my body is activated by an outside stimulus. My ears hear the sound of frying bacon. My nose detects its smell. My eyes can see it cooking in the pan. Sensory receptor apparati. Number 2, transduction. The job of the sensory apparati is to convert whatever energy the stimulus possesses into specific electrical patterns that can be understood by the body. The ear translates sound waves into electrical impulses. The eye translates electromagnetic radiation into the same. You might recall our babblefish metaphor from a few lectures back, the alien in the novel, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that served as a universal translator. Yeah? You could insert that metaphor here. Number 3, routing. In general, these electrical patterns are routed to the brain. Many actually go to the center of the brain, to the thalamus, a region we discussed in a previous lecture. The thalamus is an egg-shaped structure in the middle of your brain whose job is to help process incoming sensory information. This routing is conceptually a violent process. The reason is that various regions in the brain act as feature detectors, only capable of analyzing specific component parts of a stimulus as they arrive into the brain. Now that's confusing, so I'd like to give an example. Let's say you're looking at a stained glass window and the information floods into the visual centers of your brain. Once inside those centers, the signals are routed to specific areas of the brain dedicated to the individual features of that stained glass. You detect and process the diagonal lines in that window in a different region than you analyze the straight lines in that window. Circular objects are detected and processed in regions of the brain different from the lines. Color is torn from the stained glass and processed into different places than either the lines or the circles. The net effect is to dismember the information, which your brain does with relish, deconstructing it into component parts. This is just like taking an ear of corn and mashing it up in a cereal factory, deconstructing it into component parts on its way to making frosted cornflakes. How do we know this deconstruction occurs? Well, patients with various brain lesions, often strokes, have been very informative. There are patients who lose the ability to see the color of objects, for example, but still retain the ability to see their shapes. This is called achromatopsia. They have lost the feature detectors that process color, but the shape detectors are left alone. They're separate. Other patients can see color just fine, but lose the ability to see categories of objects. For example, some have lost the ability to recognize animals, just animals. They retain the ability to identify all other objects. There is a patient who has lost the ability to detect where vowels should go in a word, yet she completely retains the knowledge of the proper placement of the consonants. Does this mean the brain is such a deconstructing machine that it separates vowels from consonants? Apparently so. That you can perceive anything, given that the information becomes as deconstructed as corn in a cereal factory, becomes an astonishing thing. The 3 steps, initiation, transduction, and routing, apply to any sensation your brain possesses. These 3 steps, odd as they are, probably are not the most astonishing part of our story. Sensation only brings you the information necessary to perceive your world into your brain, but you haven't perceived anything yet. If you want another first-class ticket to amazing, consider what the brain does next. We call it, appropriately enough, perception, the second great step in the journey to making sense of our world. Perception takes place where sensation leaves off. It's formally defined as the brain assigning meaning to the wildly disparate, deconstructed electrical patterns currently jumping up and down your brain as if in a mosh pit. Psychologists have traditionally divided the mechanism of perception into 2 large subcomponents, bottom-up processing and top-down processing. We'll go through each, starting with bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing is defined as the brain's ability to take balkanized features of a stimulus and combine them into a meaningful, unified percept. A classic example is reading text. Let's say you're looking at the back of a box of Quaker puffed rice cereal, reading some zany offer they're giving away. Just as an aside, that's actually a fun thing to do with that brand, especially if you look at their history. In 1955, they stuffed into their puffed rice cereal boxes a deed for a 1-inch square piece of the Canadian Yukon. It was a promotional for Quaker-sponsored radio shows involving the Canadian Arctic and was an actual legal document which you could own. You could read about it on the back of the box. So, let's say it's 1955 and you're reading about this strange promotional. Your eyes are busy looking at the various diagonals, circles, straight and curved lines that make up the text of the Yukon offer, faithfully deconstructed by the sensation step. Bottom-up processing begins the process of reconstitution. With bottom-up processing, the diagonals, circles, and lines begin to be transformed into actual meaningful words. You are seeing shapes, yet you are perceiving meaning. Diagonals and circles turn into Canada, the Yukon, and the weird. Bottom-up processing is unifying various disparate features of a stimulus into a meaningful percept. How does your brain do that? We have no idea. At this point, the brain hasn't revealed the secret handshake that would allow us to understand the clubby world of the bottom-up. And the next step, what we call top-down processing, is even more mysterious. Before your brain will allow you to perceive something, the now unified percept goes before what appears to be a cognitive committee for evaluation and reflection. Call it the top-down processing committee. Top-down processing is informally defined as the explain this in the light of previous experiences and provide commentary, please, part of information processing. When you read the back of the cereal box, your brain chooses to do a number of things to the bottom-up information before perception is allowed. You may compare it to previously stored information, a form of pattern matching, like this is the weirdest thing I have ever seen. You may call up your expectations into the percept during processing, perhaps culturally derived, then mix them into your perceptions. The committee may even alter what you think you perceive, also based on prior experience. Your brain is quite willing to insert, even subtract pieces of information not in the original percept if it thinks that percept needs amending. This is the hallmark of top-down processing. Because of this step, you don't perceive what is actually out there. You perceive what you expect is actually out there. It doesn't matter how talented you are, or how high your IQ soars, or how attentive you are to detail. Every brain has a committee that decides whether something that is being detected will also be perceived, down even to the contents of the stimulus. Sound impossible? It's very easy to demonstrate. One famous experiment was done by Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons. You can find it on the internet just by entering Selective Attention Test Video in your search engine. It involves showing a class a video of two basketball teams, one dressed in white t-shirts, the other in black t-shirts, tossing around basketballs. The class is told to count the number of times one of the teams actually passes the ball, visual bookkeeping hallmark. When the video is over, the class is then asked if they saw anything unusual. Usually more than half say, "No, we saw nothing." The other half may look quizzical. Some may even be laughing their heads off. Why these contrasting reactions? The answer may have to do with top-down processing. Midway through the video, a person in a gorilla suit steps into the front of the frame, pounds her chest, and then exits. More than half the class does not see it. The phenomenon is usually called inattentional blindness, and it's often brushed off by the explanation, the brain didn't pay attention to it. But that is just ignoring something important. There is an astonishing fact in the creamy center of this experiment demonstrating the power of top-down processing. You can actually show there is photic exposure of the eye to the gorilla gets into the brain, even in people who say they don't see it. It goes to the retina, to the thalamus. It gets routed to the visual centers near the back of the brain, and then it vanishes. Where does it go? Once again, we have no idea. Somewhere during higher processing, the brain seems to do two strange things. A, it erases the image, and B, fills in what's left with surrounding material. After all, the people who reported not seeing anything did not also report a gorilla-shaped silhouette where the image had been punched out. They saw nothing unusual. Does this mean that the top-down processing feature says something like, gorillas aren't supposed to be on basketball courts, so I think I'll either delete the image or not allow its reconstruction, then backfill with the video's background parts? Once again, we have no idea. The gorilla experiment is real and illustrative. In our cornflake metaphor, this is akin to the steps that occur after the corn has been reconstituted into flakes. You might recall that stuff gets added to the cornflake that were not originally given by nature. They're sprayed with excess sugar. They're also sprayed with extra vitamins. Just like your brain does in top-down processing, right before it allows you to perceive something. With this interesting, if slightly disturbing, top-down editor working in our brains, we're ready to talk about multisensory processing. The idea here is simple. Most of the inputs we receive in the real world stimulate several senses simultaneously. We watch a lion open its mouth and at the same time hear it roar. We rub perfume on our neck, feeling its coolness on our skin while simultaneously smelling its fragrance. You might expect that these various signals might talk to each other. They might affect each other's performance. Given the power of top-down processing, they might even influence how and what you perceive. That is exactly what you find. The senses do cooperate. They affect each other's abilities to perceive what is out there. Probably the most famous example of this influence is something we call the McGurk effect. The best way to describe the McGurk effect is to show it.
Ga, 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 ga.
What did you hear? Did you hear the syllable ga? Well, that's what you should have heard because that's what he's saying. Now listen to this. He is still going to be mouthing ga, but we've turned off that sound and instead dubbed in the sound ba. Now listen to this.
Ba, 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 ba.
Now, did you hear a difference? Most people who say they do hear a change. It's now saying the, something intermediate. We gave your brain contradictory information. You did not hear either ga or ba. You heard the. The brain, it appears, has decided to interpolate the contradiction and solve it by coming up with its own creation. It forces you to hear something that isn't actually there. Talk about editing. The McGurk effect, as it has come to be known, works in every language that has ever been tested. This is a fine example of the fact that the senses influence each other. And not just what we hear. What you see while you're eating breakfast can influence the flavor of breakfast. One experimenter took an orange drink and colored it red with food coloring, then gave it to unsuspecting test subjects. They all thought they were tasting cherry. We usually receive inputs from multiple sources simultaneously, and we have to integrate them to make sense of our world. All of these senses have to undergo bottom-up, top-down processing. Here's the point. The brain is fully capable of integrating many sensory inputs, then putting its editorial stamp on the percept before kicking it upstairs so we can consciously perceive something. This idea that multiple cues usually arrive at our perceptual doorstep have given rise to something we call the binding problem. Before we get into the practical application of this stuff, I'd like to talk about it. You might recall I said that most inputs are broken down into their component parts as the brain processes information. Remember that lines are processed in different places than circles? You even have an area of the brain dedicated to recognizing faces. It's called the fusiform gyrus. Once again, we invoke our cornflake deconstruction-reconstruction metaphor. The great question is, how do we put it all back together, reassembling the information to make a coherent whole? You are so going to get sick of this. We have no idea. The only progress we've made is to give it a name. We call it the binding problem. You have not solved a puzzle, however, simply because you have named it. I will have more to say about the binding problem in the next lecture. This notion that our brains are constantly reading the environmental cues, then binding them together into coherent experiences has important implications for learning. And so we enter into our last section, practical applications, which involves how you should memorize things. We begin with two big fat ideas, both of which have gone waddling out of the door of academia and right into our classrooms. One called context-dependent learning, the other state-dependent learning. Context-dependent learning is described by a simple principle. We remember things better if we're asked to retrieve them in the same physical, multisensory context in which they were initially learned. The conditions experienced in the retrieval step should match the conditions experienced in the encoding step as closely as possible. There seems to be something about remembering how we bound everything together that helps our recall. This has been shown in many interesting, sometimes hysterical ways. The most famous was conducted by Alan Baddeley and Duncan Godden, Alan Baddeley of working memory fame, in 1975. The researchers split a collection of scuba divers into two groups and gave each group a list of words to memorize. The first group was not given the list of words until they were underwater. The second group was not allowed to go into the water, but was given the list of words on land. Alan then tested their recall and ran smack dab into context-specific learning. If the people who initially memorized the list underwater were also allowed to do their retrieval task underwater, they scored much better than if they were asked to retrieve the information on land. Conversely, if the people that initially memorized the list on land were also allowed to do their retrieval task on land, they scored much better than if they were asked to do their retrieval information underwater. This has since been replicated many times, often in odd contexts. Flotation tanks versus lounges have been tried. Room temperature has been investigated. Even the presence or absence of environmental noise. In the latter case, you really do recall things better in a noisy room if you first learned the information in a noisy room. Which sounds like a contradiction, which it is. These experiments got their data by manipulating external physical environments, but that is not the only condition that can be tested. What about the state of the psychological interior of the learner? Let's say you're jogging and are given a list of words to memorize. You are internally physiologically aroused by the jogging, which, as we'll learn later, does many things to your brain. Is retrieval better if you are asked to recall them when jogging, when you are similarly aroused? How about if you learned something while you were calm? Your psychological interior is at rest? Is the learning more robust if we asked you to retrieve something while similarly at rest than if you were asked while walking on a treadmill? The amazing answer to both questions is yes. The same principle appears to be in play. If you can match your interior psychological state at retrieval with the state you were in when you first learned something, your retrieval of that learning is also more robust. The more you can recreate the multisensory environment of encoding, even if all you do is pay attention to internal cues, your recall is going to be better. Astonishingly, this is even true for mind-altering substances. If you get drunk or high during the learning event, and yes, alcohol, marijuana, and amphetamine have all been tested, your recall is more robust if the experimenter gets you drunk or high before you're asked to retrieve the information. This phenomenon has been given a name, appropriately enough, state-dependent learning. Your lecturer, just so you know, does not advocate recreational drug use to improve learning. These substances almost universally hurt learning. We're only talking about mismatches between encoding intake and retrieving output. Context-dependent and state-dependent experiments have profound implications for education, for business, and even law enforcement. Indeed, the data were first derived from investigations of a rape case. The woman was raped while jogging, but could not remember anything about the assault. That's fairly common, by the way. Amnesia is often the brain's response to trauma. But her brain seemed to be recalling something. Police noticed every time they took her back to the place where she was assaulted, she became visibly nervous and afraid. One day, several months later, she went jogging again. Suddenly, the memory of the assault intruded into her conscious awareness. By recreating the environmental conditions of the assault, from the physical pounding on the pavement to the internal aroused state that naturally occurs when jogging, she was eventually able to retrieve those wretched memories. The practical applications of these findings are obvious once you start thinking about them. It follows the philosophy of the late Stephen Covey, who said, "Begin with the end in mind." Let's say you have to learn something over which you will be tested, or at least called upon to retrieve, at a later date. I advocate a 3-step practical guide for improving the efficiency of the performance. Call this the John Medina Breakfast of Champions recipe for memorizing things. Step number 1, testing conditions. Figure out the physical space where the retrieval is most likely to occur. Look at the room, assess its temperature, its lighting, desks, even what you are currently wearing. Step number 2, replication step. Match encoding with retrieval. Attempt to do all your learning in the very spot where you will also be required to regurgitate. If you can't use the actual place, make a mock-up of it somewhere and learn your material there. The important point is to match the present conditions of initial encoding with the eventual conditions of the retrieval. This is beginning with the end in mind. To summarize, we have taken an odd trip into multisensory perception, which involved taking an odd trip into cornflakes. Your body acquires sensory information via receptors, transduces the information into electrical patterns, then sends it off to the brain. This is the equivalent of corn being harvested and sent to the cereal factory. The brain then deconstructs information with various feature detectors processing specific inputs in disparate regions throughout the brain. This is the equivalent of the corn being deconstructed into component parts once it reaches the factory, grits, as you recall, which looks nothing like the original plant. Finally, the brain assigns meaning and even adds new information to the original perceptual stream and, as we have seen, is just as capable of taking away information. Only after this editing process is reality boxed up and sold to your conscious awareness. This is the equivalent to adding artificial ingredients to the corn grits, artificial meaning substances the corn did not originally possess. Only after these additions occur is the cereal boxed up and sold to stores. Like I said at the very beginning, multisensory perception is an extremely complex process. Many parts remain mysterious. And we're not even done yet. In the next lecture, we will discuss the sense that has received the most attention and the most research dollars, the sense of vision. We'll get into some heavier brain science here, but what we'll see is that even in this most mature research effort, things are as similar, as elusive, and as weird as ever. Just like finding you could own a piece of Canada by purchasing a box of cereal.